Okay. In hopes of getting us back on track, but if not, we're going to keep going. There's buffers built into the schedule, so we're just going to allow everybody to take the time they need and try to stay on track as best we can. So thank you all for staying or for coming. We've had a really amazing morning with presentations and conversation about very important issues facing women in Louisiana today. We're going to continue that discussion over lunch with Dr. Janet Allured, who is a professor of history at McNeese University and has a forthcoming book, Second Wave Feminism. And I know you just presented here on campus earlier this week, but I know that even if you were there, you want to be here too. So without further ado, Dr. Janet Allured.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here again, and I am actually giving a different talk today than we did on Sunday. And as Jennifer said, I've taken my talk today from my book, which is called Remapping Second Wave Feminism, the Women's Rights Movement in Louisiana, 1950 to, I think, 1990. We kept changing the dates. I don't remember exactly where we ended it, but it's due out later this year from the University of Georgia Press, which is the same press that has done Louisiana Women Volume 1 and Volume 2. Had a good experience with them. And in this book, first I'll tell you a little bit about the book, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today from the book. But in this book, basically, I argue that the South had a vigorous feminist movement that has been unrecognized, or under-recognized anyway. It had a cadre of defiant activist feminists who supplied the national organizations with both ideas and personnel, and of course conducted their own local grassroots organizing as well. In other words, feminism was part of a regional movement against social injustice that Southerners of all ethnic backgrounds initiated and energized. And part of my goal in writing the book was to literally refocus feminism, or remap feminism, to pull the gaze away from the bicoastal bias that dominates the national narrative and look at the movement on the ground floor, the grassroots workings of the movement. In the South, look at the movement in the South, and notably in New Orleans, which was a particularly important nexus for Southern feminism. So in other words, what I'm attempting to do in the book is kind of flip the narrative or reverse the national narrative to show that there was movement of people and ideas in second wave feminism from south to north, unlike what most people perceive, which was that the movement of ideas and people was from north to south. In fact, a lot of it was going the other way. But a lot of those women, A, did not seek the limelight. A lot of the women who were responsible for that didn't seek the limelight, and B, just were not written about sufficiently enough for Yankees or Northerners or Westerners to recognize that. And as I said also, it was a multiracial movement in the South, but as elsewhere, it's predominantly white. But one of the things that I do argue in the book is that in Louisiana, and from Louisiana I extrapolate a little bit across the South, because there's only beginning to be work done in the South on second wave feminism, so I have to guess. And I don't care if people come along behind me and prove me wrong about these things, that's fine. I just want to start the conversation and let people get talking about that. But one of the things that I argue in my book is that black and white women worked more closely together in Louisiana, perhaps throughout the South, than happened elsewhere. Again, in the North, what you hear about are the tensions and the struggles and the fact that they couldn't get along and they didn't understand each other. Well, I don't see that nearly as much in the South, and certainly not in Louisiana. And that, for whatever reason, maybe because they had been working together for so long, I don't know. I don't really try to unpack that. But I have talked to a lot of these women. I did a lot of oral histories, and I just don't see those tensions and divisions such as have been documented elsewhere outside the South. Black women in the Louisiana movement often worked singly rather than in groups toward feminist goals because their primary collective activity was on behalf of their race. So they joined white independent feminist organizations in relatively small numbers. They also worked within mixed gender organizations in their own communities, and it's important to look there for Black feminist activism. As historian Becky Thompson notes, those organizations that confront gender, race, sexual, and class oppression, whether named as feminist or not, need to be considered as integral to multiracial feminism. So in other words, you have to broaden your scope and broaden your focus in order to see or to recognize feminism where it is working and where it is moving. If you just stick with National Organization for Women, you're going to miss a whole lot of feminist activity that's going on out there. Okay, so just to summarize that, when we look at grassroots feminism in Louisiana and probably throughout the South, there's a number of us who are working on this right now. It often confounds our received wisdom about what the feminist movement supposedly looks like or looked like. All right, in this talk, I'm going to focus on the anti-violence movement. We'll see how far I get. Oh, I was going to turn my timer on here so I don't go over too much. And I'm going to focus on the anti-violence movement in some of the Louisiana cities that I've studied, partly because I knew that the panel before me was also focusing on the anti-domestic violence movement, and that worked out really well because I think their presentation shows how the movement has evolved and how far we've come from where we started in the 1970s, as you mentioned, which is when we first began to get any kind of awareness of this problem, pervasive problem of domestic or intimate partner violence, as they call it now. This battered woman syndrome is what they used to call it. Right. So that was one reason I decided to focus on that section of my book and talk about the origins of the anti-violence movement. But then the other reason I decided to choose this topic out of many that I could have selected that I write about in the book is because this was very local and very grassroots. I mean, a lot of feminist achievements or successes are at the federal level. And there is some, as you mentioned, VAWA, some successes at the federal level also. But much of the anti-violence movement is very, very localized and very grassroots. And therefore, it's kind of idiosyncratic, too. It'll look different in different places. And that's because of the women involved, personalities, the individuals, the women involved, because of what they're dealing with, because of what resources they might have, because of the power structure and their relationship with the power structure. There were a lot of variables, as you said. So it would look a little bit different in each one of these communities. And remember, it's brand new. The movement is brand new. And the institutions that they're setting up are brand new. So there's no rules. I mean, there's no best practices. There's no training. There's no anything. They're just making it up and figuring out what might work. And then eventually, you kind of evolve towards a more professionalized model, such as you were talking about and your other presenter was talking, Michelle was talking about as well. All right. So this was certainly one concrete success that they talked about so well and outlined so well, I think, for us in the preceding panel discussion. It was one concrete success of the feminist movement that they can point to at the state and local level. Now, having said that, that it's grassroots and it originates in the local communities and comes up through those local communities, feminists in Louisiana were certainly aware that there is a movement out there. I mean, they're all in communication with each other. Feminists around the United States are in communication with each other. So they're not isolated. They understand that this subject is coming up and is being discussed and is being talked about. But as I said, still their responses are at the community level, and in each place it's a little bit different. So I only have time to talk about a couple of them because I also want to get a chance to talk about, I hope I get a chance to talk about the anti-DV movement. And I'll lead off here, appropriately enough, with Lafayette. And like any good historian, I'm going to read this part. In 1973, news reporter Kathleen Thames wrote a candid series on sexual violence for the Lafayette Daily Advertiser. She reported on changes around the country that provided rape survivors with better services than what currently existed in Lafayette. She decried the shame of sexual assault and the tendency to blame the victim. And she characterized the Lafayette Parish coroner, Dr. Henry Voorhees, as unsympathetic and uncooperative. Thames, that's the reporter, cited compelling evidence, and I'm quoting here. At a public hearing a couple of years ago, she wrote, he commented that a particular woman could not have been raped because she was fat and had pimples. He disagrees with statistics which indicate that nationally only 2% of all reported rapes are unfounded, and said that wasn't true in Louisiana. Now, this coroner, Dr. Voorhees, expressed views that were typical of the rape culture of that era, wherein women were viewed as seductresses and men as pawns in their lair. Thames, whom one of her friends described as a flaming liberal lesbian, did not allow Voorhees' comments to stand uncorrected. She lauded feminists as the only people trying to reform rape laws and create new ways to think about sexual assault, that is, as a crime of power, not of passion. Years later, Lafayette feminists like Sarah Brabant, who I will talk a little bit more about later, still talked about her hard-hitting reporting with awe. That a fairly conservative newspaper in a heavily Catholic area of Louisiana headlined the issue of sexual violence indicates that by 1973, a great deal of public discussion already surrounded the topic. People from many different backgrounds, including those who favored few other feminist goals, threw their support behind efforts to reduce violence against women, including forms of assault that occurred behind closed doors and that were cloaked in secrecy. Once convinced of the magnitude of the problem, nearly all progressive religious denominations in Louisiana defended the establishment of rape crisis centers or services and related measures such as police sensitivity training, the creation of battered women's shelters, and the strengthening of rape laws and domestic violence laws to make arrest and conviction of offenders easier. People of faith defended women's right to feel safe inside the home as well as in public, and their right to be treated with dignity when they were victims of a sexual assault, regardless of whether or not they knew the perpetrator. Conservatives pushed back, arguing that efforts to stem male violence against women violated family privacy. But almost as soon as the services were offered and women began taking advantage of them, rape crisis and battered women's centers gained powerful support from multiple quarters. By the 1990s, agencies and programs in Louisiana designed to secure women's safety had become professionalized and institutionalized and could claim an impressive degree of success. So as I mentioned, I'm going to start with the anti-rape movement, and I will start here with, the anti-rape movement beginning here, yeah. In the book, by the way, I talk about the history of rape. I talk about how it was racialized, how it was very seldom prosecuted, but in the interest of time here, I'm going to eliminate that discussion and instead start with second-wave feminism, where, as you've already mentioned, second-wave feminists begin to understand rape as a manifestation of patriarchy. They deconstruct it that way, as a manifestation of white male power and privilege. And they deconstruct that myth that blamed rape on women's provocative behavior or dress. White women began to understand something that black women had always known. Their behavior could consist of little more than acting and dressing as social norms dictated that they should. Women came to recognize that they were not at fault for what had happened to them and that they should not feel shame or guilt. Rape was a political problem and therefore a matter of public policy. In other words, the personal was political. So one of the contributions to understanding of rape that second-wave feminists made. In the North and the West, anti-rape initiatives came from radical white women, the only ones daring enough to broach the subject in public, because remember, nice ladies didn't talk about sex in public in the 1970s. But in Louisiana, and perhaps throughout the South, while radical women played an important role in the creation of counter-institutions, the anti-rape crusade came from many quarters, including from universities. And I will start here with New Orleans. The first city in Louisiana to establish a rape crisis service, RCS, Rape Crisis Service, is New Orleans. Here, the initiative was spearheaded by a social worker and instructor at Tulane School of Social Work, June Twynham was her name, under the auspices of the city's Human Relations Commission, and she was on that commission. She put together a special rape task force made up of many different women's organizations, ranging from the Junior League, the Ladies Auxiliary of the Chamber of Commerce, and radical feminist organizations in the city. The task force drew upon the work of a couple of local studies of rape in New Orleans. Two UNO professors showed that the local newspapers were likely to sensationalize the rapes of white women by black men, but underreport or ignore altogether the rapes of black women by white men. or white women by white men. These professors also exposed the horrible treatment women suffered at the hands of the all-white NOPD, New Orleans Police Department. The complainant was taken to police headquarters where two male police officers who believed that, and I'm quoting, at least half of all rape complaints were unfounded, delivered a barrage of questions designed to break down an alleged victim whom they believed to be lying. Police were much more likely to be suspicious of a woman of color, especially if her attacker was white, but regardless of her race or ethnic background, they kept her in the interrogation room for hours. Police officers had received no training, and there was no mechanism for controlling the quality of the interview. The NOPD, in other words, was one of the chief culprits in the intimidation and harassment of rape victims. The professors who conducted the study also scrutinized the procedures. Excuse me just a second. I'm going to do a Marco Rubio there. Also scrutinized the procedures. The Orleans Parish coroner medically examined the victim, although the exam might not take place until the next day when the office opened for regular business hours. The coroner made a police report but offered no treatment. He told the victim to see her regular physician if she had concerns about pregnancy or venereal disease, but gave her no referral for psychological counseling. At no point in the process of reporting a sexual assault did a woman see another female face. The task force, headed by June Twynham, that's the social worker I mentioned, recommended establishing an autonomous rape crisis center at the YWCA, a woman-run institution which had a multiracial staff and board. Starting with a hotline staffed almost entirely by volunteers, the RCS opened at the Y in 1974. The volunteers also provided escorts to accompany women from the police station to the coroner's office and pressured the city to change its procedures. In a blaze of publicity, by the way, and it did. The city did change. Women could now go to Charity Hospital for treatment and to Pontchartrain Mental Health Center, which was a state-supported institution for psychological counseling. Survivors were no longer required to give their names or to report the crime to the police in order to receive care. The YWCA hunted down sources of funding and secured grants from the United Way, CETA, which is CETA, a War on Poverty initiative. In other words, that's federal money. And the New Orleans branch of the National Council of Jewish Women provided funding so that they could begin to pay some staff and not just depend on volunteers. And what I wanted to get at the source of funding, partly because to show that they were getting some legitimacy. They have to go through the channels in order to get that funding. In New Orleans, many of the grassroots organizers of the RCS were radical lesbians, members of the radical wing of the feminist movement, also referred to as women's liberationists. They were generally separatists and wanted women to depend on themselves alone. They advocated self-empowerment, self-defense classes, and they eschewed existing institutions that were run by men. That's one reason they liked the YWCA, because it was an all-woman organization. But not everybody involved fits that description. Not everyone involved in RCS was a radical lesbian. The management of the YWCA were not. They were married heterosexual women, and they often clashed with the RCS people. And I interviewed a lot of those people, and those tensions were still apparent decades later. They were all professional, and it was kind of an undercurrent, but you could definitely tell that they were not friends. And there was still some resentment going on there. Regardless of their sexual orientation or their political philosophy, the anti-rape crusaders, nearly all of whom were white in the beginning, were actively anti-racist. They reached out to the black community, and they recruited black volunteers for the RCS. In fact, one reason they decided to locate RCS at the YWCA in the first place was because of its interracial initiatives, which the YWCA had had those for many, many years, and the fact that it was a fully integrated board. In other cities around Louisiana, mainstream women's organizations, or sometimes church groups, took up this cause. In Lafayette, outrage about the public comments made by the coroner, Henry Voorhees, spurred women to create the Mayor's Commission on the Needs of Women as mentioned earlier, in about 1974 or 1975, led by Sarah Brabant, who was not sure of the date. And apparently we lost the documentation that would have told us that. Professor of social anthropology, and I keep pointing here because she's sitting right here in front of me. I'll say that for the camera, and I should get you to stand up before we're done here. Professor of social anthropology at ULL and a member of the National Organization for Women. Led by Sarah Brabant, the members of the Mayor's Commission created a coalition of women's groups to sponsor a public hearing on rape at the Lafayette Public Library in 1978, with attorney Sylvia Roberts as moderator. She's from Baton Rouge, and I have a whole story on her too, but in the interest of time, I will move along. Following this, which was kind of a speak out, Brabant helped establish a rape crisis service in Lafayette that was independent of the police and independent of the district attorney's office. Baton Rouge had a rape crisis service that was under the auspices of the district attorney's office. That didn't work out very well because the DA wanted those women to bring charges. And the rape crisis service said, we want to give them services regardless of whether or not they bring charges. So there was a lot of tension involving that. Now that feminists had made the issue a subject of public conversation, it was no longer a source of shame and isolated mental torture. Survivors of sexual violence began coming out of the closet. Demand for services increased. Once women had greater control over the process and female volunteers assisted along the way, a survivor could expect to be treated with compassion rather than with suspicion, and the process became more humane and less judgmental. The criticism and blame began to shift to the male perpetrator where it properly belonged. Additionally, those involved in anti-rape efforts, which increasingly included survivors themselves, began replacing the term victim with survivor in standard parlance. That too became part of the process of empowerment. In addition, grassroots organizers worked to reform Louisiana's outmoded rape statutes. Women seldom reported sexual violence, in part because they knew the perpetrator was unlikely to be prosecuted, or if he was prosecuted, unlikely to be convicted. Louisiana women from many different backgrounds supported strengthening the rape laws in order to make them more effective. They joined the Louisiana District Attorneys Association to lobby for a variety of reforms designed to fix this broken system. The existing law had only two categories of rape, simple and aggravated. Simple rape was limited to instances when the victim was incapable of understanding the act, was tricked, drunk, or drugged, or was a child. The other option was aggravated rape, which carried the death penalty. In this category, the female was required to resist to the utmost or be under the age of 12. Representative Billy Tozan, the author of the bill to create a middle category, pointed out that the existing statute was the only crime in the state that required the victim to put her life on the line before it could be prosecuted. Furthermore, because the penalty was death, prosecutors were reluctant to bring charges. And even if they did, juries were reluctant to convict. The penalty was too severe. A more moderate punishment would ensure a higher percentage of convictions. Tozan's bill passed. It made homosexual rape a crime, which it had not been previously, and established a new category of forcible rape, a middle ground between simple and aggravated rape, punishable by 1 to 20 years that would bring more convictions. Another law prohibited a victim's sexual history from being used as evidence in the case as well. Now I'll turn and talk a little bit about the battered women's movement. And again, those were just two examples, and that was going on all over the state. Like the anti-rape movement, the anti-battery movement began as a grassroots effort among women who had no training except their own direct or indirect experiences with domestic violence. Before feminists made an issue of what they initially called wife beating, there was virtually no attention paid to it. Marriage counselors and social workers referred to it as family maladjustment and blamed both parties equally. Women in violent relationships, they said, wanted to be abused. This is the myth of masochism. Police, if called during an altercation, did not intervene, considering it a domestic dispute and not a crime. It was not a crime under the law. The reborn feminist movement changed all that. Unlike previous explanations that depicted domestic violence as an individual psychological problem of both the batterer and the victim, 1970s feminists analyzed it as resulting from gender inequality, as you explained earlier very clearly. The structural problem of male dominance in the home and in society allowed men to batter with impunity and prevented or discouraged women from escaping violent situations. The first services for battered women in the state grew out of the same YWCA in New Orleans that hosted the rape crisis service. The volunteers on the phone lines and the counselors who ran a support group, a peer support group on one night a week, first at the Y and then at Pontchartrain Mental Health Clinic, began to see and hear women coming in with stories of domestic abuse. So it's interesting how it evolved organically, like you were talking about the homeless women. You began to discover that these homeless women had all these stories of domestic abuse. So you find out about it through other ways. And on the ground floor, that's exactly what was happening. People didn't recognize the severity of the problem until they began to establish one service, and that led them to understand this other problem that had caused what they were trying to help with initially. So again, the women who were manning the RCS hotlines began to hear from women who were suffering from domestic abuse. So they reported this, and that caused the director of the Y to begin documenting the calls, so then she could look for sources of funding, which she did, and she got that in 1977. And that money allowed her to hire someone by the name of Jan Logan, who had a master's degree in counseling, but she doesn't know anything, of course, about domestic violence because nobody did in 1977. But they were going to learn. They're going to learn on the ground, and then they're going to begin offering to train other people just based on their own experience. So Logan then trained volunteers. There was only enough money to pay her salary at first, not enough to provide residential shelter or transitional housing, even though the calls to the hotline showed that there was enormous demand for this. Now, it's interesting, too, who supported the anti-violence movement. I found this startling, at least. Maybe you won't, but I did. There was a significant percentage of Catholics who supported the anti-violence movement in Louisiana, beginning with the National Assembly of Women Religious, and I guess this was common all over the United States. National Assembly of Women Religious, the nuns or sisters, women religious is the term that they began to use in the 1970s. That was a liberal organization, and they came out against, made a statement against domestic violence as a social justice effort, basically, in the mid-1970s. So you would expect liberal nuns in the 70s maybe to be supportive of this effort, but also the Catholic Daughters of America, and that was not a liberal organization. The Catholic Daughters, CDA, that's a lay organization, and they were much more conservative. In the 1970s, the women religious, the nuns or the sisters, were far more liberal than the laity were. And the Catholic Daughters is a lay organization. But interestingly enough, among the Catholic daughters in Louisiana, one of the more famous Catholic daughters in Louisiana was Congresswoman Lindy Boggs. And she doesn't get any credit, but she was at the federal level the first person to raise this issue of domestic violence and first to try to get funding. And it's partly because she was a Catholic daughter. And she, I argue in the book, paves the way actually for the Violence Against Women Act. But again, a Southerner who doesn't get credit for what she started, right? I'll talk a little bit more. Let's see, I'll go ahead and do that now. Congresswoman Lindy Boggs, for those of you who don't know, was the first woman to represent Louisiana in the House in 1972. She's a Newcomb grad. She is Catholic. She distinguished herself in Congress as an early advocate for abused women and children. She sponsored a bill in 1977 that would have provided grants to the states to fund programs such as the one that was operating at the Y. Of course, she's from New Orleans. In a press conference designed to drum up political support for the struggling bill, Boggs maintained that the problem of battered women and children was, and I'm quoting, a tragic one of frightening proportions and could not be ignored. Domestic violence has been a hidden problem, she informed her listeners, such as rape and child abuse were at one time. Like these problems, spouse assault is grossly underreported. I am hopeful that our bill and the discussion which it will produce will help everyone understand the enormity of the problem and will act as a catalyst to bring together the various programs, organizations, and laws that can be helpful in offering early relief and long-term solutions. So exactly what you ended up doing. She was pushing for that in 1977. Thinking it a non-controversial measure, she was shocked when it encountered opposition from conservatives who regarded it as anti-family. Now, I could talk a great deal about that, but in the interest of time, I will move along. Boggs continued to lead on this issue, despite the opposition both in Congress and in Louisiana. Though she did not claim credit, she was in many ways responsible for Louisiana's first shelter, which was Crescent House, established in 1979 with the assistance of the Catholic Daughters of Louisiana and the Archdiocese of New Orleans. Archbishop Philip Hannon donated the house. Again, the women are coming to him, asking him to do this. And the head of Associated Catholic Charities, a sister, administered the program at Crescent House. Pat Evans, who was the head of the Women's Bureau in the 1970s and also Catholic, got some funding. She managed to fish some funding out of the hat, state monies for startup funds. Notably, both the Archbishop and the Catholic Daughters generally worked against feminist initiatives. They worked against the ERA, ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment in Louisiana, for example, because they associated the ERA with abortion rights, and so that was a no-go as far as they were concerned. But on this issue, feminists and anti-feminists were on the same page. The first director of Crescent House was a young Jewish woman, Jace Schinderman. I interviewed her too. She now lives in the Northeast. A Catholic representative in the House, a man by the name of Nat Kiefer, sponsored legislation to fund the program on a more permanent basis. And so, as with rape crisis services, women of all political and religious backgrounds came together to provide a previously non-existent service or to meet an unmet need. This story was repeated around the state. Within a short period, the anti-DV movement had shifted public opinion enough to garner, in Louisiana alone, millions of dollars for programs. Now backed by the state, shelters opened around Louisiana, some in rural regions because women living in remote areas insisted on it. In Lake Charles, where I'm from, also the same thing happened. A group of people from the churches got together and convinced the Sisters of Charity, who ran the hospital, St. Patrick's Hospital there, to convince the diocese to donate a piece of property, which had been at one time a monastery, was unused at the time. And so St. Patrick's essentially donated this property for the first women's shelter, battered women's shelter in Lake Charles also. But the board consisted of people of different churches, basically, including the rabbi, the local rabbi. Methodist ministers, black, white people, and then Catholic sisters were on that board as well. So initially it was almost always the churches that did this, the liberal progressive churches that started these battered women's shelters, provided the funding for them. While clergy and houses of worship provided resources that helped shelters get started in Louisiana, survivors of domestic abuse quickly became involved as well. One was Ann Steer, her name is spelled S-T-E-H-R, who became director of the Baton Rouge shelter following her recovery from a near-fatal single incident of intimate partner violence. In 1979, Steer was divorced with a young child when a man she was dating entered her home and shot her several times after she tried to break up with him. He left her for dead and went to his office and shot and killed himself. The doctors told her it was a miracle she lived. It was a difficult road back to health, but the experience was transformative, she told me. I felt spared for a reason. I felt like I had been called to do this. A native of Alexandria, Louisiana, Steer had always considered herself a feminist. Like many Louisiana second waivers, she had been a social worker. And after becoming director of the Baton Rouge shelter in 1982, she went to Southern University Law School and obtained her law degree in 1992 so that she could work towards strengthening Louisiana's laws against domestic violence, which she then proceeded to do, again, in conjunction with a lot of other people. But she still does that. She still works on upgrading the laws, such as you were talking about. I'm basically a lobbyist for that cause. In retrospect, the gains made by the anti-violence movement were quite striking. Kentucky anti-violence activist Carol E. Jordan has said accurately that the first 2 decades of the domestic violence and anti-rape movements resulted in more legal reforms for women than the previous 3 centuries combined. The anti-rape and the anti-battery movements drew skeptics and doubters at first, but after feminists' massive education campaign in the 1970s, people of diverse religious backgrounds came to support both movements. Though some male political conservatives continued to oppose it, anti-violence initiatives unified women across a spectrum of viewpoints, both feminist and anti-feminist. Formerly battered women and mostly secular feminists had first raised awareness about domestic violence and changed the paradigm for understanding it as a crime that necessitated state intervention. But religiously devout activists, even those who might have classified themselves as political conservatives, joined forces with female attorneys, district attorneys, lesbian feminists, and social workers to build political support for the anti-violence movement. This movement shattered the 1950s complacency about the home as a haven and the family as a source of emotional comfort and sustenance. Feminists and formerly battered women had shown that it could be hell, not just for women, but for children too, if it remained a sacrosanct space that men controlled. And I'll stop there, thank you, and ask if you have any questions. Can't believe I got it all in. Oh, wait. About a minute to spare. Any questions?
Janet, was everybody cooperative with you when you asked to interview them? Did anybody not want to talk?
I don't think I ever got anyone that didn't. Sometimes it was hard for me to, it's not that they said no, but they're just busy a lot of times. And as I was saying to someone earlier, like Sarah's still an activist. Once an activist, always an activist. Sometimes I just can't pin, I couldn't pin them down sometimes. I couldn't get as much access as I wanted just because they didn't have time. But I don't recall anyone ever saying no to me outright. I suppose if they didn't want to, they just wouldn't have replied or something like that. By the way, I started this project in 2007, so I may not remember some of those things from the beginning, so it was a long time ago. Are there any other questions?
One of the things that you've talked a lot about throughout this project was the role of the religious, and in particular the Catholic Church. Can you talk a little bit about Janet?
Mary Riley? Yeah.
No, she was. So somebody I didn't know before this.
Well, nobody knows her. This is the amazing thing. Nobody knows her. So in Louisiana Women Volume 2, and we're doing the launch this evening at 6 o'clock with several of the authors will be here. And this is edited by two people in the audience. You can wave at the camera if you'd like. Shannon Freistek and Mary Farmer Kaiser.
Oh.
There's a camera that back there behind. And they did a fine job, I should say. But anyway, my article in here is about a woman religious. Janet Mary Riley is her name. And she was one of the first female law faculty members in the United States. She was one of 7. She was on the faculty at Loyola in the 1950s. She was one of 7 female law faculty members at the time. And she became instrumental in primarily ending the head and master system of the community property system in Louisiana. That's the system that in the marital regimes, as they call it, when you got married and there's community property, the head and master allowed the husband to control that property, which would be one way that he could control the wife, right? So technically the wife owned half of the property, but she didn't control the property. So the husband could mortgage it or sell it or do whatever he wanted to, and there wasn't really anything she could do about that. And by the 1970s, other states are changing that, and they're moving to a system of equal management. Other states that are community property states are changing that, and also France has changed it. And of course, France was kind of the basis for that in the first place, and France has begun to change that as well. And so there's a trend in that direction, but needless to say, the Louisiana legislature was recalcitrant and not wanting to change it. And Janet Mary Riley, for a variety of reasons, became kind of the chief person that spearheaded the campaign to put into place equal management, gender neutrality in the law, right? So that property has to be, if you're going to mortgage it or sell it or alienate it or whatever, if it's real estate, it takes the signature of both spouses. So one person can't do it without the knowledge of the other, right? And Janet Mary Riley, unbeknownst to everyone at the time, was a member of a secular institute, which was not, I'm not Catholic, by the way. I don't know if those of you who are Catholics, are you familiar with secular institutes? Yes. Well, you're
Catholic and I do.
No, most people have never heard of secular institutes because they were kind of a transitional thing for a little while, where they allowed women to take vows, and she did take the vows of poverty and what are the other ones? Poverty, chastity, yeah, and obedience, that's it. Poverty, chastity, and obedience. I was going to say, she never married. I mean, that vow right there. She was married to Christ, basically. She was a bride of Christ. But they did not let anyone know that they had taken those vows. There was like a subversive thing. And that was actually part of the mission, was they were supposed to work undercover to do God's work. I know it's like stealth nuns, like stealth They're stealth sisters. Yeah. They're like subversive sisters.
Every sister.
Every sister was a stealth sister, she says. But, it wasn't like a subversion, but it was like you weren't supposed to let people know, because the idea was you could do your work better if they didn't know that you had taken these vows. And so they didn't dress any differently, like don't wear habits. They didn't live in a community, right? So their community was nationwide, and they would meet once a year, meet each other and go into retreat. But otherwise, the people in her community had no idea. People in the community where she lived had no idea that she was actually married to Christ. She was a bride of Christ. And so she did this. She came to a feminist position over time, partly because she came to see feminism as appropriate for someone who was faithful to Jesus and faithful to God and faithful to the Bible and faithful to the Pope. I mean, she, like a lot of other Catholic feminists, took their direction from the Word of God in the Bible, but also from what the Pope was saying and what the Vatican was saying, because Vatican II happened, right in the 1960s, and there was a whole lot more gender equality. The language of gender equality was emanating from the hierarchy, and that's all they needed. I mean, people like Janet Mary Riley and feminists in the Catholic Church, and there were a lot of Catholic feminists in the 1970s. They took that as their cue, and to mean that the church is supporting this movement towards gender equality, and she was one of those. And so she supports the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment in Louisiana. That, of course, never happens. The Louisiana legislature never ratifies the Equal Rights Amendment, and as you know, that is never ratified nationally either, because too many states took that position. So she adopts feminist positions ultimately, and as I said, most famous for spearheading that reform of the head and master law in Louisiana. Anything else you want me to say about that?
It's just the social justice and the Catholicism that's just not in the narrative at all.
Yeah, especially not in the South.
Yeah.
You don't think about Southern. She's born and raised in New Orleans, Yeah. Go ahead, Vaughn.
Well, I think if you're on that topic, you have to take note of the fact that the social justice within the church was really pushed by the women, not by the priests. It was religious,
Grassroots.
staunch women like someone out there trying to amazing models of strength and courage.
This is Vaughn Baker, if you didn't know that already, Dr. Vaughn Baker Simpson. And I also talk about her in the book a great deal, and talk about that in part of the book. Another pushy woman.
Pushy women.
Yeah.
But something made us able to be, and I would credit my ability to be a little bit pushy to two things. One was Sarah's leadership, and the other were the nuns as I was growing up. And the fact that
Again,
I
it's
had
single-
really strong role models in some of the nuns who were in their special way rebellious against the patriarchy that still reigns in the church.
These all-woman organizations, right? Like the YWCA, where you control your own space, you control your own property. They ran the things themselves. They ran these schools. They ran these institutions. Yes, they absolutely provided a role model to women coming up.
And just to let you know, Sarah, we spoke about Sarah before. If you need those records, I'm a current member of the Lafayette Commission on the Needs of Women. We have all of those binders.
Oh, good.
From the beginning.
I would like to clarify that, Dave. That would be great.
We have all the documentation, we have everything since the beginning. We recently had to write a report to justify ourselves because the former mayor wanted to disband the organization.
And your name is, I'm sorry?
Well, Sally Donlin.
Sally Donlin. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Were there any other questions? All right. Well, Sarah, why don't you stand up, since I referenced you so many times in this talk, and say hi and wave at people. She's one of these feminists that I interviewed and got so much information from. And she's also been recently honored, right? What were you honored for? You want to talk? She's a trailblazer. She
They
is.
named award, the Sarah Brabant Trailblazer Award. So.
But you were also recently recognized otherwise.
Well, by the Democratic Parish, I got the Kathleen Blanco Leadership Award, and she got the first Sarah Brabant Trailblazer Award, so we're not sure. This is just absolutely, sit here and listen to what you did. I think you have done a remarkable job.
Well, thank you.
I find myself often sitting, listening to the history of things, and I was there, and I don't recognize what they're talking about.
Was I love it. Now, I want to second that because I feel the same way. And when Chad was interviewing me, I found myself in the very peculiar position of being an historical document myself. That's a strange feeling. But I want to tell a Sarah story about her, some of her activity in all this, because it was amazing what she led us to do and her foresight. The Mayor's Commission wouldn't still exist but for Sarah, because when we all got politically cleansed when Douglas Stratt came in as a Republican mayor, many of us on the commission really were so upset we wanted to disband the commission. And Sarah stood there and said, "You can't do that." She said, "If the structure's gone, it's gone forever. We will never get it back. It doesn't matter who takes over. If the dinosaurs take over, we can still get it back later." And it's still there, and it's still doing good work. But Sarah's idea of it was she knew we were in a revolution. She called me one Sunday morning or Saturday morning and said, "Put on your counter-revolutionary shoes. We're going to Baton Rouge."
I love that. Put on your counter-revolutionary shoes. I didn't get that one.
Yeah, I love that statement too. That was a real.
Well, they were dressed like they were nice little mild people. That's what that meant.
Well, what you can't see about
And then they
Sarah-
got there.
What you can't see about Sarah is that she was brought up to be a Georgia debutante. And she has this dual persona. She's Dr. Sarah Brabant, but she's also Sally Calloway from LaGrange, Georgia. And she dropped into that role with the most squint-minded, cretin-headed politicians from little towns in North Louisiana, and stood up and said, in that wonderful Southern drawl, "Now, I know you fine gentlemen would never let anything happen to your wives and your daughters and your sisters, but all the men out there aren't like you." And then she'd run into the bathroom and she'd beat the wall and utter every curse word you've ever heard and go back out there and charm those old men. It was wonderful to watch. And then we went to Pat Evans' office and we talked to Pat, and Pat laughed at us. She said, "They threw y'all to the lions." And we realized they had thrown us to the lions, but it was still.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Vaughn, because this came up on Sunday too, and our talk about the difference between northern feminists and southern feminists is a lot of it is that politics of respectability, like you were talking about, and that's why people don't notice them a lot of the time. They're stealth. Another way they're stealth feminists is because they're dressed like debutantes or like, very demure ladies or anything. But you're.
We were or we were their students. We were lucky enough to have been their students, like I was back then.
Right, but my point is that to look at them.
They didn't look any different, and unlike the ones in the north who were dressing very differently or they looked like radicals, and so the press would gravitate to them and take their pictures because they were just outrageous looking, and they did this shock and awe thing, and you just don't tend to see that as much in the South, which is why they don't get as much attention, right? And the newspapers didn't gravitate to them.
Doris Bentley, she's saying, Doris Bentley always wore a blue rose.
Oh,
And just looked impeccable. I mean, she was the lady.
especially is she white or black? White. Doris
She
was white.
was one of the three white.
One of the three white people. Yeah, because you had a biracial coalition as well.
That's
Yeah.
what did it.
Mhm.
And when she died, Judy and Della and I went to, and we put 4 blue roses in her casket. But we were never blue rose people. She was the blue rose people. I just have to say that you have to give homage where it's due. I owe my PhD to my first husband, who called me stupid one time too often. And aside from being a debutante in Atlanta, which I kept as a deep, dark secret for years, I have to owe it to I was an abused woman. sexually, emotionally. The battering didn't really start until, which is classical, until after the divorce. And then I will not bore you with all of that. But I think that was true. Have you found that with others?
Sorry, what?
Their own battering led them.
Into feminism?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, maybe it could be that, or just whatever. There was usually some kind of incident, but it may not have happened to them. It might have happened to someone else.
They
But it
knew.
not necessarily abuse. Could have been something
I'm
else.
very excited about her book. It was fun being interviewed. We had several meetings over at my house. And I think
Thank you.
you've done a beautiful
Well, thank you. I
job.
hope you're pleased with the results.
I am very
Thank you all
pleased.
so much for coming.
And we tried